Hi, welcome to the Critical Criminologist. I'm Alex Vitale, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, and I'm joined today by Marisol LeBrón, who is assistant professor in the Department of Mexican Americans and Latina Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. Did I get that right?
Yep.
And she is the author of a fantastic new book, Policing Life and Death: Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico, from University of California Press. I feel like I should be getting some subsidy from them because you're like the third UC Press book I've talked about this month, I think. So they're doing some great books on this topic. So Marisol, welcome, and maybe you can start by just giving us a little bit of an overview on the book.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So the book was has been a long time in the making. I'm happy to finally see it out. It was my dissertation project. So what I try to accomplish in the book is a couple of things. The first thing that was really important for me with the book, coming from an American studies background, was to try and look at policing as a lens to understand something about the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the US. So, a lot of how we talk about colonialism and US empire is relegated to the past, right? So, we talk a lot about kind of the American century or American exceptionalism. We think about it as really um, this frenzied moment of 1898 and the Spanish American War when the US takes on all these possessions, and we don't really have a sustained, at least in my opinion, kind of discussion of ongoing contemporary colonialism. I think that's changing. But so one of the things I try to do with the book is look at policing as a way to say if it's really difficult to kind of ascertain what the reverberations and continuities of empire are today, how can we look at these kind of punitive measures and attitudes in Puerto Rico and actually understand how those punitive attitudes and policies arise from the nature of the colonial relationship between the US and Puerto Rico. So that was a huge part of the kind of impetus for me in writing the book, was to kind of get at some of those kind of contours of the contemporary colonial relationship. Another part of what I try to do in the book is really think through the nature of racialization in contemporary Puerto Rico. And this is another kind of way in which I try to use policing as a lens to uncover something that is largely hidden from mainstream conversations, or at least considered not polite, right, or somewhat taboo, which is to say that Puerto Rico largely and Puerto Ricans largely like to consider themselves as not having the same kinds of issues of racial animus that dominate or seem to dominate in the United States, right? There's an understanding of Puerto Rico as a racial democracy, similar to other sites in Latin America, like Brazil, for instance. So this idea that racial mixing has kind of created this um, racial utopia where everyone is mixed and therefore no one can be racist, right? And so when we look at policing, we actually see that not only does policing produce racially disparate outcomes, right? So we see in Puerto Rico, much like in other parts of the world, that Black and dark skinned Puerto Ricans receive the brunt of these punitive policies. But we also see that policing plays a key role in Puerto Rico in how race is even understood and how race is constructed, right? So, what racing does is actually make race real and felt in the landscape in many ways, right? Through those policing actions, right? It creates this racialized understanding of contagion and danger that are key to the racial imaginary in contemporary Puerto Rico. So those are some of the kind of goals I tried to accomplish in tracing the story in the book of the rise of punitive governance in Puerto Rico throughout the kind of late 20th century into the present. So,
And I think you point out in the book that racialization is compounded by the fact that many or a significant part of the darker skinned part of the population are more recent arrivals to the island, so that there's also a xenophobic quality to it. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's hard. So that's a lot of how race gets displaced in Puerto Rico is this idea that Black folks in Puerto Rico are Dominican, right? And so I talk about this a little bit in the book. It's one of these strands in the book that I wish I had done more of, right? I like to talk about it as my kind of shadow book that the book you wish you had written, right? But one of the things that we see is that because of this idea that everyone is mixed or kind of has a more mestizo, mixed racial identity, when you see darker skinned folks or or when folks are identifying as Black, right, there's an idea that those folks can't be Puerto Rican, right? That they have to be either African American, other kind of Black Caribbeaners, and particularly Dominican, right? So a lot of how Blackness is functioning in the Puerto Rican popular imagination is it gets kind of put off onto Dominicans. So one of the things that we see is that, and Natasha Alford, who's a journalist, she's doing this work for the Pulitzer Center, has done a series of really amazing articles about this, about the policing of Blackness in Puerto Rico. One of the things that we see that I've seen in my own work, but that Natasha's really been showing in her work, is that Black Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico experience policing at a variety of levels, right? So on the one level, they're experiencing this racialized criminalization, right? This idea that they are a kind of locus for criminality, right? A cause of criminality that they, because of their race, are criminogenic in some ways, right? The other thing that they're experiencing, right? So they're experiencing this constant surveillance, but on top of that, they're experiencing this idea that they are there as undocumented immigrants, right? As illegal immigrants, and so they're experiencing then on top of that this kind of xenophobic immigration control. So one of the things that and we just saw this with the coronavirus and the kind of criminalization that's happening right now in Puerto Rico around the curfew laws and the kind of draconian stay-at-home laws that are being instituted in Puerto Rico is there was just footage released of someone who was out when they shouldn't have been, breaking curfew. And one of the things that the police ask him on video is whether he's an immigrant, whether he's Dominican, right? And so we see that there's these added layers of how race is kind of at play in how policing functions in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I just got off the phone with a number of activists in Kenya where we were discussing this issue. And of course, it's always those already criminalized and most vulnerable populations that receive the bulk of police attention and police intervention. So recent migrants, informally housed people, sex workers, et cetera. So the COVID-19 situation is just compounding their precarity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned that your interest in this topic was organized around your interest in colonialist literatures and post-colonial studies. So how did you encounter literature about policing, and how was that integrated into your thinking about this project?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the way I like stumbled upon this project, so to speak, was actually through what ended up being the third chapter of the book, which is a chapter about the policing of underground rap in Puerto Rico, and by extension, the policing of kind of informal youth cultures. And so basically when I was doing my graduate work, I was, really interested in reggaeton music and was writing this paper about or thinking about writing this paper about race and gender and reggaeton music. And as I was doing the paper, I kept coming across these articles about these police sweeps and raids in record stores where they would confiscate huge number of albums, they would arrest and give citations to record store employees. And this phrase, mano dura contra el crimen, mano dura contra el crimen, iron fist against crime kept coming up as I was doing the reading. And that's kind of how I came into the project. And I hadn't had any kind of experience with with the literature on policing and kind of dove head first, right, into it. And really, part of how I kind of came into it was through thinking, around questions of these long racial histories of policing, right? And so thinking about kind of the long history of the role of policing in creating and consolidating ideas around race in the U.S., right? And there's a super rich literature in Black studies around that. One of the folks that I worked with at NYU was Nikhil Singh, right? And he's done some work around those topics and was really useful for kind of introducing some of that. I was also fortunate enough to go to graduate school with Stuart Schrader, and we were buddies. We were in the same cohort essentially, and it was really awesome to do these projects together and to really be in dialogue about some of these kind of works that were really at that time while we were doing our graduate work kind of emerging in the field. We were starting to see this kind of boom of text. But I think one of the first kind of texts that really was formative for me was Ruthie Gilmore's book, Golden Gulag, right? And in particular around these ideas of racialized vulnerability, that book really crystallized a lot for me in thinking through some of those ideas. But also in terms of work on Puerto Rico, there's also been a kind of long history of texts that I think we wouldn't necessarily consider carceral studies texts, but they really try to think through these questions of colonialism through the modes of repression through which colonialism often functions, right? So thinking about kind of the long history of policing of nationalists and pro-independence movements, the policing and repression of the movement to stop the bombing campaigns in Vieques, and even thinking about Eileen Finley's book, Imposing Decency, right, which is about the kind of criminalization of sex workers and women, right, in Puerto Rico. So those are some of the ways in which I kind of got into the topic, and how I kind of came to the project a little bit through those literatures, right? But thinking about the work on the kind of criminalization of the pro-independence movement in Puerto Rico, one of the things that I tried to do with the project is to not simply talk about police repression in Puerto Rico as something that's solely experienced by the pro-independence movement, right? So one of the things that we see is that takes center stage, right? We don't really see a lot of literature that's really engaging with questions of racialized criminalization, the criminalization of poverty in Puerto Rico. And so trying to say those two police responses are actually more connected than they initially appear, right? And help us to think critically about the colonial condition in Puerto Rico.
Exactly. I think that, a lot of the mainstream police studies literature is so technocratic and devoid of any broader analysis that it thinks about political policing and street policing as totally disconnected realities. But anyone who comes at this through a lens of race studies, colonialism, sees how these things are always interconnected. And your book, of course, does this throughout, and not just in the ways that police are used to repress movements, but this organic connection between austerity politics and mano dura policing. So I thought that was, one of the more powerful things about the book, and especially the way you showed how Puerto Rico was sort of a testing ground for both of these.
Yeah, what we see, I mean, in Puerto Rico, in some ways, this is the kind of thing I try to hammer home in the book, right? Is that in some ways Puerto Rico is this really unique case, right? Because of its ongoing colonial status, its relationship to the U.S. But in some ways, a lot of what we see in Puerto Rico parallels with what we've seen with the growth of, punitive regimes and policies all around the globe, right? So we've seen with increasing austerity throughout, right? We've seen these kind of turns towards more and more punitive measures as a way of containing the kind of ongoing effects of that austerity, right? And so Puerto Rico is definitely not immune from those trends. The kind of argument that I make in the book, though, is that definitely it echoes those trends, it parallels with those trends, but it's also taking shape in a very locally specific way, right? So, Puerto Rico essentially during the mid 20th century is this kind of test case for American democracy, right? It's this kind of colonial vitrine, the showcase for American democracy, the antidote to Cuba, right? So you have Cuba on the one hand, which is this model of Soviet style development, and then Puerto Rico becomes the counterpoint to that, as to say, like, this, when you align yourself with the United States, this is the kind of incredible growth and prosperity that you can experience, right? And so what we see during the mid 20th century as a result of these kind of industrialization by invitation schemes, they were called Operation Bootstrap in Puerto Rico, that there is a kind of tremendous amount of like increased living standards, increase in life expectancy, right? There is this kind of incredible economic growth, but that growth always was leaving out significant portions of the population. It was benefiting corporations more than it was actually benefiting most of the laboring class, right? And so by the late 1970s, those kind of industrialization schemes had already started to show their failures, had already become kind of apparent, and those are compounded by kind of a number of global kind of shocks, right? So what we see in the 1980s, essentially, Puerto Rico has this kind of weird status in relationship to the U.S. because it's not really showing the successes of U.S. development. In fact, we start to see rising levels of crime, rising levels of economic and social insecurity in Puerto Rico. And so as a result, Puerto Rico has to kind of think about what to do, right? How to continue to cement its status and significance, not only to the United States, but within a larger global political and economic field, right? And so one of the things that we see in Puerto Rico and that I kind of track in the book is that it implements austerity regimes, and it kind of does so, in this full-throated kind of manner of fully adopting these austerity regimes. But it not only adopts these austerity regimes, but it says, like, we're actually going to give lessons to the United States and also to Latin America and the Caribbean as well as to how to contain the kind of crises that arise from these austerity regimes, right? And so we see that Puerto Rico in some ways pioneers a lot of the kind of privatization schemes for public housing, a lot of the kind of what we would identify as kind of, Stuart Schrader would kill me right now, but the militarization of the police, right, in terms of kind of these partnerships between the National Guard and civilian police, right? And so we see that they try to create a number of innovations to not only contain the effects of austerity, but also to market themselves as kind of key innovators in the realm of security, right? And to say, to other kind of locales that are implementing these draconian austerity measures, we have lessons to teach you about how to contain these effects, right? How to increase your bottom line, how to cut costs, and also how to keep your population in line, right? How to keep your laborers in line, how to keep the people who are not at work in line, right? And so that's one of the key things that we see, that austerity takes place in Puerto Rico like it does in other places, but because of its kind of colonial status, the way that they respond and what they try to do, what they try to show through those austerity measures ends up looking a little bit different, right? It ends up taking on a kind of locally inflected kind of nature.
Yeah, including, putting troops on the streets so that, you're not using militarization of police as a loose analogy. That it was pretty concretely that was what was occurring there. Another area where in some ways Puerto Rico has been on the cutting edge is this criminalization of popular music that you mentioned earlier. And are you aware that Forrest Stewart has a new book coming out about the criminalization of drill music in the United States? it's
Yeah.
going to really continue to contribute to this conversation.
Yeah, I've seen the book. It looks super interesting, so I'm excited to read it. Is it out already, or it's
It's
coming
not
out, right?
out. I've read it. It's very good, and Forrest is going to come on, do an interview shortly that will release as the book comes out. But he, takes a very similar line, and I think he was writing it before your book came out, so it does. I don't think it references you.
Yeah.
The version I read didn't have a full index and references, so it could be in there and I missed it. Um, but he shows also this, it has this promise for young people as a ticket out of
Yep.
extreme poverty, but the process of pursuing that dream invites both intercommunity violence and criminalization. And so this is also often the problem, right? When you're already in a disadvantaged condition, the strategies for getting out of it are going to be 10 times more difficult and, in this case, dangerous to pursue.
Right. Right.
And then the irony of that effort to use culture as a way out is then turned back as evidence of why these people don't deserve to get out and why they need to be further managed, criminalized.
Yeah, and that's definitely what was happening in Puerto Rico around underground rap was the kind of lyrics were taken as fact, right? And so they were used to kind of demonstrate the supposed depravity and criminality of public housing residents. Sorry, I have a cat
Yeah.
tail in the scene. My cat like just jumped on the table. But there's definitely this kind of way in which it ends up becoming this very convenient way of justifying these policies, right? And justifying these really long kind of racial tropes. These racial tropes, a super long history of ideas about Black and poor people's kind of sexuality, about their morality, about the need for intervention, right? This way of pointing at this music and saying, look, they can't even govern themselves. That we need this kind of overt, direct kind of intervention in these communities because listen to the culture that they're producing, right? And so it becomes this really convenient justification that at least in Puerto Rico, in the case of Puerto Rico, I mean, I was there conducting the bulk of the research in 2011 and 12, and then going back periodically, and it was still things that I heard when I was there. That was like, underground rap is just a front for the drug economy. All of those guys are involved in kind of criminal enterprises. They're not musicians, they're not artists, right? So this idea that somehow these kind of musical subcultures end up being distinct from other kinds of forms of fiction, right, or creative enterprises. So it's really becomes a super convenient kind of excuse for the state.
Well, and to pursue these kind of mano dura policies requires that there be an ideology of personal and group moral failure that is to blame, because the whole project is about distracting us from the economic and political roots of these problems.
Yeah, and I mean, there's tons of examples of that I came across. That it's personal responsibility only for some, though, right? Because
Right.
one of the examples I talk about in the book is that at the moment that they're doing these police raids, the police are busting down doors in public housing, and they're sending these on the one hand, and then on the other hand, they're sending these polite letters to the owners of these kind of luxury vehicles. So kind of elites in Puerto Rico, doctors, lawyers that were going to public housing to cop drugs. They were sending these very polite letters from the police department that said, just in case you didn't know, your car was spotted in a dangerous area. And for your own safety, you should stay away from these areas because you don't want people to get the wrong idea and you don't want anything to happen to you. And so we see that it's this idea of personal responsibility for some, right? So where folks in public housing are 100% responsible for all of the conditions that exist there, as well as all of the kind of punitive responses that are then enacted to respond to those conditions, while elite social drug users are seen as kind of these innocents who might have mistakenly driven by or somehow tempted and lured into public housing, right, through these kind of so-called degenerate cultures, right? And so we really see that it's this kind of uneven application of even ideas of personal responsibility.
You know, there's a lot of critical geographic literature about how police maintain boundaries, whether these are racialized boundaries or class boundaries in the United States. But you show that in Puerto Rico, this is not just an indirect or abstract process, that they were actually building walls, you know, backed up by military troops at times.
Yeah, so one of the things that we see in Puerto Rico is this kind of rise of gating, and Zaide Dinzy Flores has a fantastic book about this called Locked In, Locked Out. That you have this simultaneous rise of gating that's happening not only in kind of rich and middle class communities, but at gunpoint, essentially with the police, happening in low income and public housing. So what we saw in Puerto Rico as part of Mano Dura contra el Crimen, which is the crime measure that I followed throughout the book, is that the police would raid and occupy a public housing complex, and then after they had kind of established a police presence, would build a perimeter fence with the help of the National Guard around these public housing complexes. And a lot of what that did was actually cement these kind of boundaries that were very much already in place in Puerto Rico, right? It hardened these kind of race and class boundaries that were already operating. And it made it much more difficult for folks to have that cross-race and cross-class contact, right? So one of the things that one of the sources that I look at in the book was actually this punk zine called Masturbana. And there's this great, like, if there's one thing that actually, like, was the most formative archival piece on my thinking in the book, it's this zine, right? This wonderful zine that I had initially come across because there was an article about underground rap in there, and then found this other article. But there's this essay in there called "There's Not Enough Jails for So Many People," right? Essentially, it's like the translation of the title. And in the piece, the author, one of the things that she says is, she's like, basically, with Mano Dura contra el Crimen and the rise of the phenomenon of private gating, essentially in Puerto Rico, there are so few places now where Puerto Ricans of various kind of backgrounds can encounter themselves. She's like, essentially what the gating has done is it's made it so that the only places you can now encounter Puerto Ricans of different class and race backgrounds is the municipal hospital or the municipal cemetery, or in traffic on the highway, right? And so, you know, those boundaries were already there. But, you know, one of the claims I make is that the policing is what made them real and actually hardened them, right? In a lot of ways, it consolidated these kind of pernicious race and class boundaries that were already operating within Puerto Rican society.
One of my favorite sections of the book is when you talk about violence interrupters. And I was not aware that there had been, you know, an active effort to put, you know, community-based anti-violence initiatives in place in Puerto Rico. And that's tied to the work that I do in New York through the Policing and Social Justice Project, and it's something that I've written about some. And how did you come across this violence interrupters effort? I'm curious about the interviews you did, because there's some really powerful material in that part of the book.
Yeah, so Puerto Rico, you know, what I look at in that chapter is actually this organization called Taller Salud. And Taller Salud is this feminist public health organization that's been around in this town and municipality called Loíza for over 40 years. And, you know, over the course of the 40 years, a lot of what they've been concerned with is women's access to reproductive health, decreasing domestic violence, increasing women's life chances, right? Loíza is in Puerto Rico, a kind of really unique geographical space. It's very very short distance outside of San Juan, so a lot of tourists that go to certain areas like Piñones think that they're still in San Juan and they're actually in Loíza. But Loíza is one of the most kind of concentrated Afro Puerto Rican populations in Puerto Rico. It's considered a kind of cradle of Black culture in Puerto Rico. It has a very long history spanning to the kind of not only Spanish colonization but also or not only American colonization but also Spanish colonization of kind of long kind of established Black communities in that area. And so as a kind of predominantly Black community in Puerto Rico, it has experienced tremendous kind of criminalization and also concentrated poverty. So it's also one of the kind of poorest municipalities in the archipelago, and it's one of the municipalities in the archipelago that's dealt with kind of incredibly high rates of crime and violence. So Taller Salud, as an organization that's based in Loíza, one of the things that they saw was that they couldn't really respond to women's health needs without addressing the kind of ongoing violence in the community that was largely gang violence, that was claiming the lives of young men and that was impacting the community. So they tried to essentially figure out how to respond to it, and they came across the violence interrupter model from the ceasefire model from Chicago, and they felt like it was a really kind of appropriate model for the kinds of interpersonal violence that they were seeing, right? It wasn't really necessarily economically driven. It had to do with kind of gang rivalries in particular ways that they understood as arising from kind of forms of territoriality and masculinity. And so they got this government grant to do a 3-year pilot program to implement the ceasefire model, and it was incredibly successful. Over the course of those 3 years, Loíza witnessed a steady decrease in violence. They had achieved over 114 days without a single homicide in Loíza, when there was a steady pace of homicides taking place every day or every couple of days. And so it was this moment in Puerto Rico's kind of contemporary history where homicides were actually increasing all around Puerto Rico and they're decreasing in Loíza, right? And so the kind of direct violence interruption mediations that Taller Salud and their Acuerdo de Paz program were able to achieve showed these incredible results. But because of the kind of worsening debt crisis, they were not able to get additional funding to keep the program going. So despite the incredible success that the program showed, they can't run the program anymore. They couldn't get additional funds to run it. They got a 1-year kind of bridge loan from the Department of Justice, but effectively the program, while it still exists, is not actually kind of occurring. And so one of the things that kind of demonstrated to me is that even when these community-based, that when you give communities the resources that they need, right, they can do that work they can actually do the things that they need to do to reduce violence. They can achieve these incredible gains and successes in reducing violence. The other thing that showed is that when you do have these successes, there's not necessarily support mechanisms for ensuring their ongoing continuance, right? The state doesn't necessarily invest those resources. So the state refuses to invest in these models that work and instead ends up putting in more policing, right? When these models are effectively left to wither. So that chapter, it's a concluding chapter of the book. It's a kind of chapter that, I offer in terms of some examples of the kind of incredible work that, ordinary Puerto Ricans are doing to think about futures that are not dependent on policing for ideas of justice and safety. And so it was really powerful for me as well because it was a feminist, woman-led effort, right? And I think that a lot of the ways in which policing is discussed and understood is in these incredibly masculinist terms, right? And so the voices that I try to highlight in that chapter are women's voices. And so I interviewed in that chapter the two women, Zenia Alejandro and Alana Feldman Soler, who were the two kind of women who were running that program, one who was the director at the time of Taller Salud, and the other who was the director of the Cuerpo de Paz violence prevention program. And for me, that was a really powerful moment in the research and in the writing of the book to kind of highlight those voices, highlight those perspectives of the work that women are doing, right? When so much of how police violence is understood is as something that uniquely affects men, right? And that men are the ones who have the most encounters with police. They are the most likely to become victims of police violence. And there's this way in which the violence that women experience is left out of that, but also the ways in which, even when women are not experiencing direct violence, the whole community is impacted, right? And I think there was a way in which Taller Salud, as a feminist organization, was really able to address police violence in this incredibly rich and ample way that produced results because it was coming from a kind of feminist perspective.
Well, and you show how the issue of like street violence among the young men is not some completely separate phenomena to the domestic violence going on in the households. And I thought that was so important because we think of these as distinct areas, but they're actually, it's all connected.
Right. And that's one of the insights that they kind of developed over the course of this pilot program, which was to say, you know, if you ask the police what causes the homicides in Loíza, they're going to say it's drugs, because the police say that drugs cause all of the problems, right? Because they don't actually know what's causing problems in these communities. And so for these women, one of the things that they said was, we see this violence as occurring in a way that is about these toxic forms of masculinity, that are about the ways in which these young men are completely disempowered economically and politically, and they seek to, much like many men, right, seek to gain access to power through violence, right? And so for them, one of the things that they did was not only these direct mediations, but they worked with these young men who were gang involved to actually change their ideas around masculinity and what it meant to be a real man, right? That being a real man doesn't mean that you use violence to defend your family and your corillo, your gang, or your neighborhood or whatever, but it also means kind of developing other coping mechanisms, other ideas of what masculinity and manhood entail, right? And so that's work that is critical to violence prevention work, right? And for them, that was key. And I think, again, this is one of the insights that they, as a feminist public health organization, were able to bring to these discussions about reducing violence, community violence. That was about, like, we actually need to do this very slow, painstaking work to change attitudes around masculinity, as opposed to the quick fix solutions of just locking people up, right? So it shows results, but it's this really slow, ongoing process.
Well, because violence is never just about some instrumental application. It's also about meaning making. And so at the community level, people understand that. They understand the nuances of what drives weapons carrying and what drives the beefs that are often at the root of this in a way that the police can't possibly achieve. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that the police are the only possible solution to these problems just rests on a bedrock of total ignorance about the actual nature of the community dynamics, which is why we have to have these community-led interventions if we're going to make any real progress. Towards the in the concluding afterward part of the book, you end up talking about the effects of Hurricane Maria, which happened, I guess, after the bulk of your research had been done. And this seems like, just another example of a kind of disaster capitalism moment, right? Where right-wing and conservative forces, use the situation to advance their pre-existing agendas.
Yeah, one of the things that we see that happens after Hurricane Maria is this kind of so-called turn to broken windows, right, in Puerto Rico. So essentially after Hurricane Maria, the Department of Justice, as well as the local kind of law enforcement apparatus, they get up on stage and they're like, crime is out of control. People are not feeling safe in their homes, so we're gonna institute broken windows policing, which was, essentially looking for these minor crimes like driving a car with expired tags and things like these running a red light and things like that, right? So they were targeting kind of low-level traffic offenses, and their argument was that this was going to increase safety in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, right? And so again, it's a super cynical way of using policing as this way to sidestep what are the actual causes of people's insecurity, right? And so after Hurricane Maria, what people are feeling insecure about was that they didn't have access to fresh drinking water, that they didn't have a roof, that their house had been destroyed, that their family members had died, right? That they themselves were at risk of death, right? That it had nothing to do with, and that people were engaging in crimes of survival, right? That they didn't have access to the things they needed, right? And so there's this cynical rollout, right, of broken windows, as if broken windows had not been in Puerto Rico since the kind of 1990s, right? And one of the things that we see is, again, this kind of like one size fits all punitive kind of response, and a lot of how that arises is because Puerto Rico can't really do much else, right? And because of its colonial status, in many ways, it's hamstringed with what it can do. This is not to say that Puerto Rican elites. I don't have any illusions that they have the interests of the majority of Puerto Ricans at heart, right? That they would do something different, but the reality is they couldn't even do something different if they wanted, right? Because I think the only thing that they actually have control over is the implementation of these kind of quickie punitive solutions. So that's definitely what we saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and I talk about it a little bit at the conclusion of the book. And I've written, one of the things that happens post Hurricane Maria is this concern with a dwindling police force, right? And so I wrote a piece in 80 Grados, which is a kind of Puerto Rican digital publication. And there's this fear after Hurricane Maria because the police, much like other workers, right, were encountering worse labor conditions, right? In the aftermath of the hurricane, they were also dealing with the effects of a terrible economy. And so they, like millions of other Puerto Ricans, joined the diaspora. And so what we see in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria is that a number of police forces, particularly on the East Coast, start actively recruiting Puerto Rican police officers to their police forces, right? And this becomes a kind of one diversity scheme to then increase the number of kind of Latino officers, Spanish-speaking officers, and it becomes also this kind of exchange, right, of police. So the Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico, they had interviewed a police officer that said he worked in the Baltimore Police Department, estimated that he had at least 200 other Puerto Ricans working in that police force with him in the kind of aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And so there's this notion that there's not enough police on the streets, and what is needed is more police on the streets. And the thing that's really ironic about that is that in the course of the research I was doing, I came across these internal documents that had targeted the ideal police force in Puerto Rico is somewhere between kind of like 8 and 13,000 officers, which is essentially where it is now, right? As a target for what it would mean to actually um, have a police force that could possibly be well paid, possibly be well trained, right? All of these kind of things. And that's where the police force is now. And it's created this huge crisis because Puerto Rico at one point had the second largest police department behind New York, right? In the US jurisdiction. They had 20,000 officers for an archipelago of 4 million people. And so we see that there's this kind of panic in these moments of tremendous insecurity over over the police being on the streets to respond to these issues of personal and social insecurity that don't actually address any of the root causes of the insecurity that the police themselves say aren't even necessary. Like the police themselves say that they would actually be more successful with or at least the reformers of the police say they would be more successful with a smaller, more adaptable force, right? But we see that there's this way in which there are these kind of prevailing economic logics and this logic of crisis control that dictate the need for more and more resources to go to the police, right? And that's what we're seeing right now in Puerto Rico in the midst of this pandemic is, again, this overly kind of punitive model where it's like people are being arrested for leaving the house on their bicycle, right? They're being arrested for driving on a day where they're not supposed to be driving because of the numbers on their plate. They need to be driving on alternate days and things like that, where it doesn't address the fact of like why people need to leave, right? That people can't do bulk purchases and be out on the street, or can't do bulk purchases and stay home, right? They need to be on the street because they only have enough money to be able to go out and get groceries a little bit at a time, right? Or they need to be engaging in economic stuff to make money, right? And so there's this incredibly punitive response that we keep seeing in these moments of crisis that don't address the root causes of insecurity, that make people's lives more difficult, that criminalize these conditions of vulnerability and lead to more and more death, right? That don't keep people safe, don't keep them healthy, they don't work, right? And you see these kind of the police themselves saying these things at certain points, right? But there's still this kind of momentum behind these punitive measures.
Well, you've hit on the contradiction here, right? Which is on the one hand, the police reformers say we want a smaller, more professional, better disciplined, better trained force. But on the other hand, the politicians are saying, but we want to turn every problem in the society over to the police to manage,
right.
Which means we have to have a massive infrastructure of policing, and these two things can't work together. And so thinking that more professionalization and more training is going to make the Puerto Rican police better or lead to better outcomes for the society is completely misguided. And I really appreciated that throughout the book, this realization is very much present. And I know that you think of yourself self-consciously as an abolitionist intellectual. Where did that analysis come from for you?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's like I said earlier, I mean, I think, Ruthie Gilmore's book was incredibly kind of influential for me. But, I think just reading more, right? I think, coming across like Angela Davis's work as I was reading more on kind of these notions of the carceral state, and seeing just the kind of contradictions, that these mechanisms don't work, that they produce more harm, they produce more vulnerability. I think that for me, it was kind of in doing the research, right? That I think the political position evolved alongside that for me, where I don't think I would have said at the beginning of the project that I was an abolitionist or that I even necessarily knew what that meant. I knew about critical resistance. I knew about these other kind of efforts, but I didn't really have a deep understanding of what that was. And I think in the course of doing the research, it becomes really apparent, right? The kinds of ways that these carceral structures create utter devastation in people's lives, right? That they don't do the things that they purport, and that there are people on the ground who are just trying to figure out better ways that have better solutions that, to solve these problems. And so for me, it was very much, I think the research radicalized me in certain ways, right? It politicized me in certain ways that helped me to kind of then I think seek out those kind of, you know, writings on abolition and those kind of activist positions, and engage more in those kind of discussions and deepening my own kind of thinking and understanding of abolition. Your book obviously was really helpful. I came across your book as I was finishing mine, and I think really helped me to also think too about, not just prison abolition, but also what does it mean to think about abolishing police? What does it mean to think about abolishing ICE, right? So, I think, it's very much my thinking around these issues is still evolving, and I'm still thinking through these issues about like what's the relationship between abolition and the state, right? What do we mean when we say abolition, and what does that mean for thinking about these ideas of anarchism and abolition too, right? And so definitely, I think I'm still figuring those things out. I'm still very much, yeah, like it's, yeah.
We were part of a conversation at Johns Hopkins that Lester Spence put together.
Yes.
You could see in the room, you could feel this tension of people trying to figure out what this thing is and how they want to relate to it in terms of their scholarship and in terms of their activism.
Yeah, and that discussion was really helpful for me. And I think, I keep getting into these discussions. I was at the American Studies Association meeting this year, and I'm part of the Critical Prison Studies caucus there. And we got into this conversation, which is there needs to be a more sustained, and this is kind of where I'm at right now. There needs to be a more sustained discussion of the role of the state in abolition, right? And like, when do we make demands on the state, and when are we actually calling for the abolition of the state? Like, and there's really different ideas about that, right? And I think, like, particularly in moments like this right now, right? We're in this pandemic, we're making a lot of demands on the state that we wouldn't otherwise necessarily as abolitionists be making, right? Have a lot of expectations of the role of the state in our lives, right? And so I think there's these contradictions that, it's again kind of, what folks like Miriam Kaba or Ruthie Gilmore or Angela Davis are always trying to drill home, right? Is that it's not a set of kind of rigid dogma or practice, right? But that it's about kind of thinking in community, right? And thinking with the community about how to create conditions of liberation, right? And so, I think that liberation, people think about it and get to it in really different ways, right? And so I'm always really excited to be in those conversations and to do that thinking, because I think it's a process, right? It's not this kind of it's not the end point, right? It's how we get there.
Exactly. That's true for the organizing and for the intellectual undertakings. Yeah. And what are you working on next?
Well, yeah, I'm not working on much right now.
Well, we're all in a tough spot. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually working on I've been working on it all year, I feel like, but I'm working on this kind of like a short pocket book. It's a short book I'm doing for a press in Puerto Rico that's actually about thinking through the lessons of the protests in Puerto Rico that ousted Governor Ricardo Rosselló. So I'm trying to think through what are some of the lessons that movement gives us, right? And the kind of argument that I make is not necessarily a blueprint for what movements need to look like, but that it offered particular kind of horizons and perspectives, around race and gender and sexuality, and how they're kind of positioned in social movements that we need to take heed of. And one of the things that I actually did talk about in this is also around the role of policing too. And one of the things that was really interesting for me with the summer protests was the ways in which I think a lot of people came to the realization that the police are not the same thing as the people, right? And so there were all these appeals over the course of the protest to the police to say, like, you guys are exploited workers too. You're being screwed over by these elites. You're working in these really dangerous conditions. You also are losing your pensions. And then the police would like pepper spray these people that were like trying to talk to them, about their similarly structured kind of inequalities under colonialism. And so for me, that was this really, I think, and for I think a lot of people, it became this moment where it was obvious for a lot of people, I think, for the first time, that the police are not ordinary workers. They're not experiencing the same kind of conditions of vulnerability, right? And they have a kind of really specific role in the reproduction of kind of elite social class in Puerto Rico, even though they are not a part of that social class, right? And I think that this summer illustrated that in some really, really interesting ways. So I've been thinking through that and working on that. And, I think I'm at this moment where I'm in after the first book fatigue. And so this has been, it's been a kind of nice project to work on, to think about something that's a little bit shorter, that's not a full length kind of book, because the thought of jumping right back into that is a little scary.
Daunting, yes.
Yeah.
So I usually end by asking if you have any recent reading recommendations for folks.
Yeah, so I just actually read and reviewed Stuart's book, which was which I think is why it's been on my mind so much, which is such a treat for me, just because I've seen him working on that book over the course of the time that we've known each other, and I love that.
Ballad of the Bullet. The Ballad of the Bullet, just so we get the name out there.
Oh,
Stuart Schrader. I'm sorry, wrong Stuart. So right. Sorry, Bats Without Borders. So Stuart was on the show a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries. And so that was a great book for me to read, because it also, I think, like, helped clarify some of my own thinking. And the thing that I love about Stuart's book is that, I think and we've had conversations about this, I think that there is a way in which Stuart does something really special in his book that's about advancing a kind of notion of the colonial implications of policing, right? And thinking about the role of policing within kind of empire, that I think is a conversation that has been really lacking within carceral studies research. And I think Kelly Lido Hernandez also talks about this kind of in her book City of Inmates, where the narrative in some ways around how the carceral state came to be is so overdetermined by particular historical moments and particular geographic relationships, that a lot of other relationships fall out, right? And in particular, questions of the colonial state, right? And so I think, for me, as someone who's deeply invested in that work, Stuart's book was really refreshing. But I think, I also think about it in terms of what I like to see in the field, right? And it's like, I think wanting to see more research on kind of the criminalization of indigenous communities in the U.S., around kind of the policing efforts in Hawaii, right? And so I think there's a lot of scholars who are starting to come up that are doing that work that's really exciting. So, it was wonderful to read his book for the work that it does, but also to think about how that might push the field in some really productive ways. And then I have not read this book yet, but I will say I'm really excited to read it, which it's on my shelf right now, which is Joanna Fernandez's book on the Young Lords, and it's this kind of magisterial giant book that I think is just uh, I'm just so excited. I think it's really going to change a lot of how we think about the history of the Young Lords, and for me, that's something that in thinking about as we were talking about these community solutions, right? Is really productive. So I'm really excited to kind of dive into that.
Yeah, you're not the first person who's mentioned that book on the show, and yeah, I've been following her work in New York, and I'm looking forward to diving into that as well.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Marisol, for
Thank
joining
you.
us today. And if people haven't yet, go out and get a copy of Policing Life and Death from University of California Press. And if you want to click the round button you see below you, you can subscribe to this. And there's also a little rectangle with links to additional videos. So I hope you'll tune in for additional conversations. See you next time.
Thank you.